Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging into a really pivotal moment in human history, the agricultural revolution. It kicked off roughly, what, 10,000 years ago?
It's right, around 9,500 to 8,500 BC. And we're going to unpack this huge shift, from foraging to actively, manipulating plants and animals.
It's kind of amazing when you think about it. For millions of years before that, humans were hunter-gatherers.
Right.
They seem to be doing okay.
Absolutely. They had rich socialized beliefs, politics, the works. So the initial puzzle for you, listening, is why? Why give up a lifestyle that seemingly worked for the incredibly hard work of farming?
Yeah, exactly. Because it was hard work. We look back now and think progress, but back then it
Yeah.
meant like sun up to sundown, sowing, watering, weeding,
Protecting crops, tending animals. It was a massive increase in effort compared to foraging.
all for this promise of more food, I guess.
Well, that's the assumption. And it wasn't a sudden flip of a switch either. This
Yeah.
domestication thing, it unfolded over a very long time.
Right. The outline mentions wheat and goats starting around 9000 BC, southeast Turkey, the Levant.
Yep, among the first. Then peas and lentils maybe 1,000 years later, around 8,000 BC.
And then things like olive trees, much later, 5000 BC, horses around 4000, grapevines 3500 BC. It's a really drawn-out process.
It really is. What strikes you about that long timeline?
Well, like you said, it wasn't some quick decision. It was gradual. And also that most of the big domestications happened in that sort of window, ending around 3500 BC.
And think about this. Even today, with all our technology, the vast bulk of our calories come from plants domesticated way back then.
It's crazy. Wheat, rice, corn, potatoes, basically the same stuff. No major new domestications in the last 2,000 years. Our whole modern food system rests on those ancient choices.
It really hammers home how fundamental that period was. And another key thing, we need to ditch that old idea of it starting in just one place, the Middle East.
Oh, right. The sources make a big point about that. Multiple independent agricultural revolutions all over the world.
Exactly. You've got maize and beans popping up in Central America, potatoes, llamas down in South America.
China doing its own thing with rice, millet, pigs. North America with pumpkins.
New Guinea, sugarcane, bananas.
Hmm.
And West Africa, too, with its own millet, African rice, sorghum, even their own kind of wheat domestication.
So it wasn't just one genius idea spreading. It was people in different places figuring things out independently.
Which leads to the question, why those places? Why didn't agriculture just happen everywhere?
And the answer seems to be suitability. Like you can't just domesticate anything.
Pretty much. Most species just aren't cut out for it. Think about trying to farm truffles or, herd woolly mammoths. It wouldn't work.
Right. So agriculture only really took off where the right kinds of plants and animals happened to exist. The biological raw materials had to be there.
Okay, so let's tackle the traditional story. The one that says this was all about humans getting smarter, unlocking nature's secrets.
Yeah, great leap forward narrative. We figured things out, settled down, life got easier, supposedly. But the sources, like Harari, really push back on that.
They do. And what's fascinating is the argument that foragers already knew a ton about their environment. Their survival depended on this incredibly detailed knowledge of plants, animals, seasons.
So it wasn't lack of brains that stopped them farming earlier.
Apparently not. Instead, the argument goes, the shift to farming might have actually led to a harder life for the average person, less satisfying even than being a forager.
No, it's counterintuitive, isn't it? More food should mean better life, right?
You'd think so. But while the total amount of food probably increased, it didn't necessarily mean better diets or more leisure time for most people.
Instead, it just fueled population growth and maybe helped create elites, people who didn't have to do the hard farm work.
That seems to be the idea. The extra food supported more people and eventually social hierarchies. But the day-to-day life for the average farmer, potentially worse.
Which leads to Harari's really provocative claim that the agricultural revolution was, quote, history's biggest fraud.
It's a strong phrase for sure, but it forces you to question the automatic assumption that agriculture was purely positive. The benefits weren't necessarily felt by the individuals doing the work.
Okay, and then the perspective flips entirely. This is the part I find really interesting. The idea that maybe we didn't domesticate the plants.
The plants domesticated us, particularly the big ones. Wheat, rice, potatoes.
Right. Take wheat. 10,000 years ago, just a wild grass in a pretty small part of the Middle East.
And now it covers a staggering amount of the planet. Think about the Great Plains in North America. Wheat everywhere. It wasn't there 10,000 years ago.
So from wheat's evolutionary perspective, making copies of its DNA, it's been unbelievably successful.
Massively successful, but how did it achieve that? The argument is it manipulated us.
Manipulated Homo sapiens, how?
Well, wheat demanded things. It needed humans to clear fields of rocks and other plants, spend hours pulling weeds, guard it against pests, lug water to it.
Our bodies weren't really built for that kind of repetitive agricultural labor, were they? The sources mentioned skeletal evidence.
Exactly. Ancient skeletons show a rise in things like slip discs, arthritis, hernias, ailments linked to the physical demands of farming. Our spines, knees, necks paid the price.
So in a way, wheat kind of
Yeah.
farmed us to spread itself.
That's the provocative idea, and it forced us to change our lifestyle completely. We had to stay put.
Because of the fields. You can't be nomadic if you have crops to tend.
Right. The word domesticate itself comes from Latin domus for house, but who ended up living in the permanent settlement, the house?
We did, not the wheat.
Okay. So what did we get in return for all this extra work and bodily harm? Was it like a better diet?
Doesn't seem like it. The sources point out we're omnivores. We thrived on variety. A diet heavy on one or two grains, it's actually less nutritious, harder to digest too.
Okay, so not a better diet. What about security? Was life safer?
You'd think maybe being settled, but no. Farmers became dependent on just a few crops.
Ah, so if there's a drought or locusts or some fungal disease.
Boom. Famine. Whereas foragers, if one food source failed, they had dozens of others to fall back on. They were more resilient in that sense.
Okay, so maybe not more economic security. What about, like, safety from violence? Were settled villages safer?
Surprisingly, maybe not initially. Early farmers had stored food, possessions, land, things worth stealing.
Making them targets for raids.
Seems like it. And unlike foragers who could often just move away from trouble, farmers were tied down. They had to defend their land.
So, potentially more conflict. Is there evidence for that?
Yeah, archaeological and anthropological studies like in early farming sites in New Guinea or Ecuador show pretty high rates of violence. It wasn't automatically peaceful.
It took a long time, thousands of years, for larger social structures like cities and states to develop and bring violence under more control, though obviously not eliminate it.
So, yeah, maybe village life offered a bit of protection from wild animals or bad weather.
But for the average person, the trade-offs, the disadvantages might have really outweighed the advantages, at least early on.
It's important to try and see it from their perspective
Right.
when we're not judging from today, where many benefit from the long-term outcomes of agriculture.
Exactly. So if it wasn't a better diet or more security or less violence for the average Joe, what did wheat offer humanity?
More food per acre. That seems to be the key. It allowed Homo sapiens as a species to multiply like never before.
Right. More calories extracted from the same patch of land compared to foraging.
The example given is Jericho. A small band of relatively healthy foragers might have lived there before, replaced by a much larger village of farmers who were arguably more crowded, potentially sicker, and working harder.
So from that purely evolutionary perspective, number of DNA copies surviving agriculture was a huge win for Homo sapiens. More people equals more copies of our genes.
But, and this is the crucial point, why would individuals choose that? Why accept a lower quality of life just so the species could multiply?
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer proposed by Harari and others is they didn't really choose it consciously. It was a trap.
The luxury trap.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that. Because it wasn't like someone woke up one day and said, let's invent farming.
No, absolutely not. It was slow, gradual, tiny changes piling up over centuries, even millennia.
Okay, so think back to hunter-gatherers. They had ways to manage population, right? Because having too many young kids while constantly moving, that's tough.
Extremely tough. So they used methods, hormonal effects of long breastfeeding, cultural norms, maybe abstinence, abortion, sadly sometimes even infanticide to space out births.
Then the climate changes after the last ice age. It gets warmer, wetter in the Middle East.
Perfect conditions for wild cereals like wheat and barley to spread naturally.
And humans, just by gathering these grains, collecting them, maybe accidentally dropping seeds near campsites, they unintentionally help spread them even more.
Right. Clearing areas by burning might have also helped these grasses thrive by removing competition.
So in some fertile areas, these wild grains became so abundant that people could actually settle down, at least semi-permanently, without fully farming yet.
Exactly. That brings us to cultures like the Natufians in the Levant, roughly 12,500 to 9,500 BC. These were hunter-gatherers, but they lived in permanent villages.
Wow, villages before farming.
Yes. They intensely harvested and processed wild cereals. They built stone houses, had granaries for storage, developed special tools like sickles and mortars.
So they were kind of proto-farmers, relying heavily on wild grains, but maybe not yet deliberately cultivating on a large scale.
Precisely. And then, over generations, their descendants started taking more active steps, saving seeds to plant deliberately, maybe clearing small plots, weeding a bit, chasing off pests.
And as they put more effort into this early cultivation,
They naturally spent less time hunting and gathering other things. It was a slow shift in focus.
no single moment you could point to and say, now they're farmers. But by, say, 8500 BC, you had fully agricultural villages like Jericho all over the region.
And this settled life, plus the potentially more reliable, if less varied, food supply from grains, allowed populations to grow.
How did that happen? Just more food available.
Partly. But also, women could have children closer together, no longer needing to carry toddlers for miles. Babies could be weaned earlier onto grain-based gruel or porridge.
Which sounds convenient, but maybe wasn't great nutritionally compared to breast milk.
Probably not. And more people crammed into villages meant diseases spread more easily. Infant mortality might have actually increased despite more births.
And you needed more hands for the farm work, creating a cycle, more kids needed, leading to more population pressure.
Exactly. More mouths to feed, requiring more intensive farming, needing more labor.
And the key here is that nobody planned this outcome. Each generation just did what seemed logical, maybe trying to make things slightly easier or more productive.
Making small improvements that, cumulatively, led them down a path to a harder life overall, without anyone realizing the big picture at the time.
It was a miscalculation, wasn't it? Focusing on the short-term gain. If I work harder, I get more grain this harvest, without seeing the long-term downsides.
Downsides like population explosion, dependency on a single crop, more disease, more work.
So why didn't they just stop? Go back to foraging when life got tough?
Well, the changes were so gradual, maybe no single generation felt a dramatic worsening compared to their parents. They likely didn't remember a radically different, easier way of life.
And crucially, once the population had grown, going back wasn't really an option, was it? You couldn't feed that many people by foraging anymore. The trap was sprung.
It really illustrates that concept. Harari calls it the iron law of history. Luxuries become necessities.
Can you give an example?
Think about modern stuff. Washing machines, computers, email, all invented to save time, make life easier.
But have they? Or have they just sped everything up, made us feel like we need to be constantly available, increase stress?
That's the argument. The luxury of instant communication becomes a necessity, then an expectation, and maybe even a burden.
So back then, the luxury of a slightly bigger harvest led to the necessity of permanent settlement and hard labor.
There were probably some groups who saw what was happening and resisted, held out as foragers for longer. The Luddites of the Neolithic.
But ultimately, farming just spread. Why was it so irresistible?
Demographics, mostly. Once one group started farming and their population grew, they simply outnumbered the foragers. They needed more land, pushing foragers out or absolving them. Foragers had little choice in the long run but to adopt farming or perish.
So the main lesson from the luxury trap idea is, chasing an easier life can lead you down paths you never intended, with consequences you didn't foresee.
Exactly. The agricultural revolution wasn't some grand plan. It just happened, driven by small, immediate decisions.
Okay, but the sources also float another possibility, right? Maybe it wasn't just a miscalculation or a trap.
Right. Maybe there was something else driving people towards agriculture, something beyond just trying to get more food or an easier life. Maybe. Ideology. Religion.
That's harder to prove, isn't it? Especially before writing. Scientists tend to focus on economics, demographics, things you can more easily measure or infer from bones and tools.
True. Direct evidence for beliefs is scarce for preliterate societies. But then you have discoveries like Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey.
Ah yes, Göbekli Tepe. This place is amazing. Dates back to around 9500 BC, right?
Unbelievably old, and we're talking huge, monumental structures. Massive carved stone pillars, elaborate engravings.
And the kicker is, it was built by hunter-gatherers before the invention of agriculture.
Which completely flips the script. Usually, we think complex structures like temples come after people settle down and farm. Like Stonehenge, built much later by an agricultural society.
But Göbekli Tepe suggests maybe complex ritual and belief came first. the effort involved,
Mm.
coordinating all those people to quarry, move, and erect those massive stones. It implies a powerful shared ideology.
A sophisticated religious or social system capable of organizing large-scale projects long before farming became widespread in that area.
And isn't Göbekli Tepe located near where one of the earliest forms of domesticated wheat, einkorn, originated?
Yes, the Krasnodar Hills are relatively close by, which raises a fascinating possibility.
What if? What if people started intensely cultivating wheat in order to support the activities at Göbekli Tepe? To feed the workers, the pilgrims, the people gathering there for rituals.
Exactly. Maybe the temple came first, and the need to sustain the people involved with it spurred the development of agriculture in that region.
So instead of farming leading to villages which then built temples, maybe the need for a temple led to farming in villages.
It's a hypothesis, but a compelling one. It suggests that human motivation isn't always just about economics or calories. Maybe grand spiritual or communal projects played a key role in driving the agricultural revolution, at least in some areas. A conscious choice for a different kind of life, perhaps, not just a trap.
Okay, so that covers plants. But the revolution wasn't just about crops. There was this other huge deal humans made with animals.
Absolutely. The domestication of animals like sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, another massive transformation.
And again, probably a gradual process,
Mhm.
not just catching animals and putting them in pens.
Likely started very gradually. Maybe selective hunting, targeting aggressive males, sparing females and young, then perhaps actively protecting preferred herds from other predators.
Kind of managing wild populations.
Sort of. Then maybe corralling them, limiting their movement, and eventually selective breeding, deliberately choosing animals with desirable traits.
Traits like being less aggressive, more submissive, fatter, producing more milk.
Exactly, traits useful to humans. Another path might have been adopting orphaned young animals, like lambs or kids, raising them, and gradually breeding the tamer ones.
And the benefits are pretty obvious, I suppose. Meat, milk, hides, wool.
And muscle power. Donkeys, oxen, eventually horses, for carrying loads, plowing fields, grinding grain. Hugely important. Some societies became primarily pastoralists, focusing almost entirely on herding.
And just like with wheat, from a purely numerical evolutionary standpoint, this was a massive success for species like chickens, cattle, pigs, sheep.
Oh, incredible success. There are billions of them on the planet today, far exceeding their wild ancestors. The domestic chicken might be the most numerous bird species ever. Their DNA is everywhere.
But here comes the big but. Again, evolutionary success, measured in copies of DNA.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean individual happiness or well-being, does it?
Not at all. And this is a really crucial and quite sobering point the sources make. Domesticated animals, despite their population boom, are arguably among the most miserable creatures ever to have lived.
That's a heavy statement. Why?
Well, compare their natural lives, lifespan, behaviors, social structures in the wild with their existence under human control. Most farmed animals today live very short lives, slaughtered as soon as they reach marketable size, long before their natural lifespan ends.
For economic reasons.
Purely economic optimization. And even those kept alive longer dairy cows, egg-laying hens are often subjected to intense confinement, unnatural living conditions, procedures that cause pain or distress, all completely alien to their evolved needs and instincts.
The book gives some pretty grim examples, doesn't it? Oxen yoked and worked constantly. Pigs in some traditional societies having noses sliced or eyes damaged to control them.
And modern industrial practices. Dairy cows kept almost constantly pregnant, their calves taken away shortly after birth so humans can have the milk. The male calves often ending up in the veal industry.
It's hard to square that reality with the idea of domestication as some kind of benign partnership.
It rarely is. Even when humans show affection, and they often do, the relationship can be complex, maybe like that between slaveholders and slaves. In some ways, the fundamental reality for most domesticated animals throughout history, and especially today, is one of subjugation.
The image used a modern calf in a tiny veal crate. It really drives home that conflict between evolutionary success for the species and profound suffering for the individual.
It does. It forces us to confront the ethical cost of this revolution.
So, wrapping it all up, the agricultural revolution. It massively increased the collective power of Homo sapiens. We multiplied, spread across the globe, reshaped the planet.
And the populations of our chosen plant and animal partners exploded alongside us. A huge success by one measure.
But the cost was immense individual suffering. For many of the humans involved, especially early on, life arguably got harder, sicker, less secure.
And for billions upon billions of domesticated animals, it ushered in an era of existence often defined by confinement, frustration, and pain, continuing right up to today's industrial farming systems.
This tension, then, between collective power or success and individual experience, individual well-being, that seems to be a central theme emerging from this whole period.
It's a crucial takeaway, and it's a theme that, as we'll see, echoes throughout human history.
So to recap this deep dive, we look at the shift from foraging, the surprising hardships farming brought, the idea of the luxury trap, the alternative possibility of ideological drivers like Göbekli Tepe, and the parallel, often grim, story of animal domestication.
The core paradox holds. What looks like progress on a grand scale might have been a raw deal for many individuals, both human and animal.
Which leaves you, the listener, with something to chew on. Think about today. Think about our current pursuits, our technological advancements, things that seem like obvious progress. Could they have hidden costs? Could they be trapping us or causing unseen suffering in ways we don't fully grasp yet?
Echoes of that luxury trap, perhaps. Or the disconnect between species success and individual misery. What does genuine progress look like, beyond just bigger numbers or faster speeds? It's definitely something worth reflecting on.
And with that thought, we conclude this deep dive. We've aimed to cover the key facets of the agricultural revolution as presented in sources like Sapiens, exploring its complexities, its costs, and its enduring legacy.